Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, where I'm showing you everything you need to know to build your own beautiful aquarium stands. In this series, we are constructing a stand to support a 125-gallon aquarium. But you can apply these same principles to build your own stand for pretty much any tank size or type. In today's part 2, we are doing a deep dive on the design of the stand. Everything you need to know to build a sturdy structure to support the enormous weights that bear down on them. And we'll also talk about planning ahead in the design, so that when we get to the finishing step, everything will come together to form a very beautiful DIY aquarium stand, which will look just like this stand I built for this 280-gallon acrylic aquarium. So thanks for joining me today, everyone. Let's dive on in. So I want to start off with a quick recap of what we covered in part 1 of this series. In the first video, we discussed in depth the material selection, and we went through why we have decided to use 2x4 construction lumber and other materials, which will result in a very strong and easy and good looking stand. Now this actually touches on the design as well, using these 2x4s. And the reason we covered it in the first video is because it also affected material selection, so we just covered it then. But it is very important to know why we feel comfortable that this will support the thousands of pounds it has to. We actually went through the math involved, so I do recommend you go back and check out that video. But suffice to say, the math tells us that 2x4s will hold up this tank. Today I'm going to tell you how we're going to design them, how we're going to lay them all out, and how we're going to tie them all together to form a very stable, sturdy structure. Alright, so first thing I want to do is talk about how we're going to design the very top of the stand, where the bottom of the tank meets the stand. And we have a perfect example right here, because this is the 280-gallon acrylic aquarium where we actually built the exact same kind of stand I'm showing you how to build, just on a bigger scale. And we are designing this stand to be versatile, useful for both an acrylic aquarium or a glass aquarium. And that matters because those two types typically have different bottoms. Let me show you what I mean. Here, if we peek behind the curtain, here on this acrylic tank, so this is a great example. So I know this is ugly, this is the back of the aquarium, but acrylic aquariums, the back is painted black, but this is the tank itself. But the vast majority of the time they're flat bottom, which means you need to build a stand that can support the entire surface area of the bottom. And we'll get into this here in a second, what these layers are. But this is different than most glass aquariums, especially glass aquariums that you buy from a store. Let me show you. If we come over to these 125 gallons, if we look up underneath them, getting a little peek behind the curtain, or under the curtain here, you can see that the bottom of the aquarium is actually exposed. All this glass is exposed. There's nothing supporting it across the surface area. What happens is the weight of all this water and rock is coming down, and the bottom pane is actually transferring the load to these vertical panels here, because then these go down into, and there's some black plastic trim here for both aesthetic and some functional purposes, but the load is actually being transferred over to these vertical panels that then bear it down into the stand, into the perimeter of the stand. So you can see here all the load is along the perimeter. So for most glass aquariums, and I say most, but most glass aquariums that have these elevated bottoms, you don't need anything here, right? Now, I do recommend having something across the middle to tie them together for stability. I don't in this case, and I actually regret not doing that. So that's not how we're going to design this stand. This is just an old stand that I built. But the purpose of what I'm showing you here is that the load is actually borne by the perimeter of the stand. Now, I want the one we're building now to be able to support both flat bottom and elevated bottom aquariums. So we are going to build it as if it is for a flat bottom, but just by nature of how this works is you can still put an elevated bottom on top of it. And even some glass aquariums are flat bottom as well. This 225 that is a DIY job that I built this, I built it with a flat bottom. And many custom glass aquariums will have a flat bottom as well. So what we're building today will work for both this and acrylic and, a store-bought glass aquariums. All right, let's come back to these layers. So this is the tank itself. Right here is what I would call the top of the stand proper. It's a layer of plywood. Now, in this particular case, I used plywood. For the build I'm showing you, we're using particle board. Particle board is sufficient. We talked about that in the last video, but I just happen to have some extra plywood to build this stand right here. So this is the flat bottom that we talked about. This covers the entire length and width. Now, what's above it is a piece of styrofoam. Now, with flat-bottomed aquariums, you need to be careful about what we call point load breaks. So there's massive weight above here, right? So and glass especially is very fragile. Acrylic can also break. If there's a tiny little bit of something between it and the plywood, then that could cause a point load and the whole thing just shatters or cracks open. So you put some sort of layer here, some substrate to absorb those imperfections. I always use 3/4 inch styrofoam. This is actually extruded polystyrene because styrofoam is a brand name. You get this at just like Menards, Home Depot, Lowe's in the construction materials section. Now, do you really need this? I'm going to say yes, but I will tell you that I have built flat-bottomed glass aquariums that I rested directly on the plywood itself, up to 60 gallons. Now in those cases, I was very careful to make sure the stand was perfectly level and true, that there were no particles, nothing between the tank and the plywood. But even so, while I've done it, I wouldn't recommend it, and I'm not going to do it again myself personally. Now you can get thinner mats. They would still work. I just like 3/4 inch. Keep in mind though that the dimensions that I'm about to outline for this stand, for this 125 gallon that we're building, assumes 3/4 inches here. So if you follow the specifications that I'm about to lay out and you decide not to use 3/4 inch styrofoam, if you use something thinner, just keep in mind that the top of your tank will be lower by however the difference in this material and what you use. Now let's talk about this right here. This is a 2x4, and very important point, note that it's built with the widest dimension on the vertical to give the most structural strength, like that. It's not built like this, right? I didn't lay it out like that. I laid it out like this. That's what we're building today, this. I have built aquariums like this. Again, I wouldn't recommend it for most hobbyists because assembling a tank where the perimeter is built like this, it adds some complexities. It is possible, but it's more difficult, and it's also not as strong. So what I'm going to outline for you today is the industry standard, I would say the best practice. Make sure your perimeter is laid out in this direction, like this. One last design principle to cover before we get to actually drawing out the specifications for this stand. Let's talk about the support that you need in the legs. So obviously we need legs on the corners, the 4 corners, right? But depending on how long of a stand you're building, you might also need support in the middle. Now this is a 125 gallon glass aquarium. It's the exact same dimensions as the tank that we're talking about today. Now what this is resting on is a stand I had built for a 7-foot tank, but it will still work for this demonstration. You can see that I have extra support in the middle. There's another rule of thumb kind of floating around in the hobby that every 4 feet in length you need to add more legs for support. It's not a scientifically rigorous approach, but it's a good rule, and I actually follow it myself. So because this is a 6-foot tank, we have the corners, right? Then we have another leg here in the middle. So for 4 feet tanks, you can just have the ends. For your 75 gallons or your 55 gallons, you can just have the corners and nothing in the middle. For your 125 gallons and 150s, you need to have some legs in the middle. When you get into 8-foot tanks, it's a bit gray, right? Because 8 feet, the 4-foot rule would tell you that you just need one leg in the middle. But at 8-foot tanks also have a lot of weight behind them because they're typically wider front to back. They're typically a little taller. So there's some shades of gray to it. So with 8-foot aquariums, I do 2 sets of legs in the middle. If you're getting into really big tank stands, like, we have a 600 and 650 gallon in this fish room, you then start, getting into the need for legs in the middle. So you have on the front face of the tank and the back face, but then also like in the middle. That's maybe a video for a different day, to be honest. Oh, and one last note. If you're not following the specifications I'm about to lay out, if you're building your own stand and adjusting the height, keep in mind, this is very important for safety reasons. Keep in mind, these things are very top heavy. We're talking thousands and thousands of pounds in the aquarium. Now, while the stand will support it, keep in mind if you get too high, then your center of gravity can become an issue, and the tank has a risk of wobbling and, worst case, crashing over. I find that for 125 gallons, tanks that are 18 inches front to back, a stand height, anything up to 33, 34 inches is good. You get up to 36 inches, it's okay. Anything above a 36-inch stand height for a 125 gallon aquarium, I would start to get a little nervous. Now you see I actually have a really big tank up here behind this one. This is the 225, and this is about 42 inches tall, which I would never build a stand for a tank that tall if it were going to be standing on its own. But I also have this stand in front of it, and I actually have tied them together on the ends to add, stability for that. So that thing won't fall. But if you're building a standalone structure, you got to be cognizant of the center of gravity and how that, gets worse with taller stands. All right, time to start designing the stand for our 125 gallon aquarium. Now, your typical 125 gallon aquarium is 72.5 inches long by 18.5 inches wide. It's also usually 23 inches tall. Now, these are critical dimensions to know when we're cutting our wood. So when we're designing our stand here, we're also going to add a little extra space around the perimeter. And I'll tell you what that's for. So as we're drawing this out, and forgive the drawing, it's not going to be perfect. But picture this is the top of the stand from an aerial perspective. This is going to be 73.5 inches. And this is going to be 19.25 inches. Now, why are we doing this? We want some cushion. We want some wiggle room around the perimeter. This is not to scale, but imagine this is actually the tank, right? This inner square. It's not to scale, but we want this extra perimeter space here, right? Now, we are going to be using that in this application to add trim. When we get to the final step of wrapping the stand in a very nice looking veneer, we're going to add actually corner trim to give it a very finished appearance. And we need this space here for that corner trim. So we need a 1/2 inch extra on both sides for that trim. So we're just going to add 1 inch to the length. Now we also need it on the front here, but I'm not going to be putting any trim on the back. So we don't need as much extra length. So we're going to be adding a 1/2 inch for the front trim. And then I added an extra quarter just for some wiggle room here in the back, right? Make it easier to position the aquarium on this thing. Now, if you want to follow along and build these exact same dimensions, that's great. And if you decide not to do the trimming step, that's great too. You can just have this as wiggle room for, make it easier to position the tank on. So to construct this, we need to cut two 2x8s to the length of 73.5 inches. Then we also need to cut a couple pieces of 2x4 to 16.25 inches. Why? Because we want the total width to be 19.25, and a 2x4 is 1.5 inches thick. So we got to think the cross braces are going to be going on the inside, right? And that's the same for these edges here. They're going to be going on the inside of the long pieces. So you take the total length, the total width you want of 19.25, and you subtract the 1.5 and the 1.5. So we need these pieces, both the cross braces and the side pieces, to be 16.25. Here's a much better representation. So we have the long pieces that we've cut to 73.5. And we have these middle cross brace pieces that we've cut to 16.25. Now add the ends, add the long pieces to that, and you end up with a total width of 19.25. And these cross braces are going on the inside, right? And we have 5 of them here. Now why do we have 5? Because this is going to be usable for a flat bottom aquarium, we need this entire surface area to be very strong. So we are going to have a piece of board kind of spanning the entire area. But we need strong support underneath that board. Because even with the board here, there's just so much weight pushing down. There is risk of the board sagging here in the middle if there's nothing supporting it. So we use these cross braces sort of like joists, like the joists that support your floor that you walk on in your home. Now, if we were doing just an elevated bottom tank stand, like the glass ones that I showed you earlier, we could get by with just these perimeter pieces. And then I would still recommend you tie them together in the middle just for stability. But you wouldn't necessarily need so much structural support underneath. But because we're making this for both a flat bottomed aquarium too, we need this. Now this spacing is important. What we have here, this works out to be with a 6-foot tank, and I'm using 5 cross braces here. This works out to be a spacing of 16.5 inches. Now I follow the rule of 18 inches on center, maximum spanning width. So I would never have, and this 16.5, if you go to on center for these studs here, that's actually more like 17.5. But I would never span more than 18 inches. Now with this 6-foot aquarium, we could do every 18 inches, and then we would get to this last section here, and this would be small, like 12 inches. But I then, kind of recalibrate. I figure out how many I need to get to the 18 inches, and then with a smaller amount left over, I always err on the side of being smaller. So then you recalibrate and respread that distance so that they're all even. So instead of having 18, 18, 18, 12, or whatever the number is, it's 16.5. So we've now cut 2 pieces to be 73.5, and we need 5 pieces at 16.25. And I know I'm being terrible here. I'm using decimal places in some areas and fractions in others. Sorry about that. All right, now to figure out how long we need to cut the wood for the legs, we first need to decide how tall we want the aquarium to be. Now, your average aquarium stand that you would buy from a store is about 30 inches tall. Now, since a 125 is 23 inches, that means that with your average store-bought stand, the top of the tank will be about 53 inches. Now, I want to make this just a little taller. I'm going to add a couple inches just because that's my personal preference. I want the top of this stand to be 55 inches. So let's work backwards here. You got 55, you got to take out 23. So I need the surface that the tank rests on to be 32 inches above the ground. Now we have to take into account these layers here. We're going back to the layers that we talked about earlier. Keep in mind that this layer of styrofoam is 3/4 of an inch. And this layer of particle board is another 3/4 of an inch. So then we get to the 2x4s here. So these are 3.5 inches. So what we have to think about here is we're going to cut 2 sets of legs. The first set of legs is going to be more like a guide. And this is really going to be the most important factor in determining how tall the stand and thus aquarium are. The top of this leg is going to be flush with the top of this perimeter 2x4, resting just underneath the bottom of the very top piece of particle board. And I have it kind of like striped here because you have to think about it, it's going to be behind some of these pieces. So imagine this is a continuous 2x4 on the outside edge. This is going to be kind of tucked up behind it. So if we want this whole thing to be 55 inches, we're down to 32, we're down to 30.5 that we need this to be. So we need that first set of legs to be 30.5 inches. Now, what's this piece right here? This is my visual representation of really the most load bearing of the legs. This is going to be the second set of legs, right? And we're going to cut these so that they fit right up underneath the perimeter 2x4s. So what we have to do is take the 30.5 and subtract the 3.5. So we need this set of legs to be 27 inches long. Now, how many of these do we need? So we need one of these on each corner. And then we've already talked about how we're going to have extra support here in the middle. That's not to scale. Great, I made it even worse. But so we're going to have one of these on each corner and then one in the middle on each side. So that is 6 of these legs. So we need quantity 6 of the 30.5 inch pieces. Now, what's the second set of legs? We're going to have one on each corner and then again one on each side in the middle. So again, we're going to have 6. Now, that's going to be more than sufficient to support this 125 gallon. And we talked in the first video about how we figure that out. But if you're making a bigger tank, or if you just want a real extra safety factor on this, you can double these up on the corners. All right, imagine you're looking at this corner top down. This is the perimeter of the stand. Now these legs, this tall leg, the 30.5 inch piece, is going to come in like this. It's going to be tucked up right in the corner here, so that the 3.5 inch dimension is this way and the 1.5 inch dimension is that way. Now this 27.5 inch leg, the main supporting leg, that's going to be tucked up under right here. Now imagine you could see through this perimeter piece of wood. This 27 inch piece will come up right here. Now this is going to form a very solid stand. But if you want to double these up, you can. And if so, the second piece would come right here. So I've elected to only use one of these on each corner because it's enough, but you can double that up if you'd like. So for this project, we need another 6 of the 27 inch pieces. Now there are some more wood pieces that we need. We need some, we're gonna need some plywood that we're gonna use to tie all this together to make it really stable. But honestly, this video has already run long enough, so I think we're just gonna address this in the next installment. And then we'll also need to cut the board for the top layer here. But again, we've kind of just run out of time, so let's tackle that in the next video. So with that, I will let Bert here say goodbye, and it looks like Samson wants to say goodbye too. So thanks again for watching, guys. I will see you next time. Take it easy.